A husband slapped his wife in front of his guests for poor table setting, but what she said next stunned everyone. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Emily opened her eyes. The familiar hum of the ceiling fan circled lazily above, and outside the first birds greeted the day. She lay still for a moment, the weight of the evening ahead already pressing on her chest. Today was the anniversary of Richard's parents, an occasion that carried more significance than she cared to admit. Emily sat up, the cool floor beneath her bare feet a stark contrast to the warmth of the covers. She allowed herself a long breath, steadying her thoughts. There was no room for error tonight. Every detail had to be perfect, not for them, not for Richard, but for herself. The kitchen was soon filled with the rhythmic sounds of her preparations, the steady chop of vegetables, the low simmer of sauces on the stove, the clink of crystal glasses as she arranged them on the dining table. She moved with precision, every motion practiced and deliberate. This was her space, her sanctuary. Cooking had always been more than a skill. It was a language through which she spoke her care, her creativity, her defiance. The menu was a careful balance of tradition and her own heritage. There were the expected Southern classics, the buttermilk biscuits, the creamy shrimp and grits, the pecan pie that Richard's father loved. But alongside them were dishes from her own roots, a slow-cooked oxtail stew, rich and tender, and a delicate sweet potato souffle from her grandmother's cherished recipe. She knew the inclusion of these dishes would raise eyebrows, but tonight she wasn't interested in blending in. The dining room, grand and imposing, seemed to swallow her whole as she entered with an armful of linens. Its heavy oak table, polished to a faultless shine, could easily seat 12. Above it hung the ancestral chandelier, its crystals casting fractured rainbows in the afternoon light. Emily paused, surveying the space. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt cold. Every inch of the room screamed of old Southern wealth, a legacy Emily had never been invited to share, only to accommodate. She laid out the table settings meticulously. Linen napkins folded into precise triangles, antique silver polished to a mirror's gleam, wine glasses aligned like sentries. A centerpiece of fresh gardenias and magnolia leaves, a nod to the south, sat proudly at the table's heart, softened by a few delicate sprigs of wildflowers, her own personal touch. It was a table worthy of any celebration, and yet she felt the familiar knot tightening in her chest. She knew exactly what they would see when they sat down. Not the beauty of her labor, but the audacity of her choices. The soft creak of the staircase broke the silence, and moments later Richard's voice floated into the room. "You've been busy," he said, his tone neutral, almost disinterested. He paused at the threshold, his gaze sweeping over the table. Emily felt his eyes land on the wildflowers, too rustic, too personal, and then on the oxtail stew, its rich aroma already curling through the air. She braced herself. "Really?" he said, a faint edge of condescension in his voice. "You're serving that?" Her hand stilled on a wineglass. She turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes," she said simply. "It's my grandmother's recipe." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "You know how my mother feels about heavy flavors. And what's with the flowers? This is a formal dinner, Emily, not a picnic." A flicker of heat sparked in her chest, but she smothered it beneath a layer of calm. "I thought a bit of warmth wouldn't hurt, and I'm not cooking for just your mother." His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment the air between them thickened. It was a familiar tension, one born from battles fought and refought over the years, most of which she had surrendered to keep the peace. But today, her silence felt like a prison she was no longer willing to inhabit. Richard exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Fine. It's your show," he muttered, turning on his heel and leaving her in the thickening quiet. Emily's hands, steady moments ago, trembled slightly as she adjusted a fork. She wasn't sure what had shifted inside her. Perhaps it was the years of subtle insults and cold shoulders, or perhaps it was the realization that no matter how hard she worked to perfect the evening, her efforts would always be weighed against an unspoken standard she could never meet. As the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting amber light across the room, Emily stood back to survey her work. The table was set, the candles ready to be lit, and the aromas of her carefully prepared dishes wrapped the space in a cocoon of warmth. But beneath the calm exterior, a storm was building. She could feel it gathering, dark and inevitable, in the marrow of her bones. Tonight would be different. She didn't know how, only that something inside her, long buried beneath years of restraint, was ready to rise. The low hum of luxury cars broke the quiet outside the house. Tires crunched against the gravel driveway as the first guests arrived, their headlights casting long beams through the front windows. Emily stood near the foyer, smoothing the fabric of her navy blue dress with hands that trembled only slightly. The evening had begun. The front door opened with a weighty creak, and the first to enter was Margaret Calloway, Richard's mother. Tall and regal, with hair as crisp and white as the pearls draped around her neck, she surveyed the room with a gaze that had made stronger women shrink. Margaret's lips curled into something that could, under generous circumstances, be mistaken for a smile. "Emily," she said, her voice dipped in cold civility. "How lovely." Emily returned the greeting with warmth that did not touch her eyes. "Margaret, welcome. It's good to see you." Margaret's eyes flicked past her daughter-in-law almost immediately, landing on the dining room behind her. The soft candlelight and the carefully arranged place settings did not seem to charm her. Instead, her brow lifted just slightly. "Oh," Margaret said, a note of mild amusement threading her voice. "I see you decided to personalize the arrangement." Her gaze settled on the wildflowers. "A little rustic, don't you think?" Emily felt the first needle pierce her composure. "I thought it added warmth," she replied, her voice even. Margaret's lips pressed into the faintest line, a gesture so subtle and so withering that it could have graced the cover of Southern Living under the headline, "Dismay in Disguise." Before Emily could respond, more voices filled the foyer. Richard's father, Thomas, entered next. Tall, silent, with a presence that needed no volume. He gave Emily a curt nod, the sort a man might give to his bank teller. Following him came Richard's brothers, Charles and Michael, each with their wives, both of whom offered the same thin smiles and the same politely disinterested glances at Emily's handiwork. The air thickened with the scent of expensive cologne, subtle judgment, and something Emily recognized all too well, the silent, smothering air of exclusion. Dinner was announced and the group flowed toward the table. Margaret's eyes swept over the dishes as if conducting an appraisal. "Shrimp and grits," she remarked, the corners of her mouth lifting a fraction. "A classic. You kept some tradition at least." Then her gaze settled on the oxtail stew, and something sharpened in her expression. "And this?" Emily met her mother-in-law's eyes directly. "Oxtail stew," she said, her voice steady. "My grandmother's recipe." A beat of silence, then a faint hum from Margaret, neither approval nor critique. "Well," she said at last, sliding into her chair with the grace of a queen at court. "That's unexpected." The guests took their seats, crystal glasses chiming softly as they were lifted and set down. Conversation unfolded in polished layers. Stock prices, real estate, idle chatter of vacation homes and Ivy League legacies. Emily, seated beside Richard, felt herself becoming invisible, a silent fixture at her own table. She knew how this played out. She had performed her part for years, smiling, nodding, blending into the scenery, but tonight the mask felt tight against her skin. The first pricks of condescension arrived wrapped in genteel smiles. Charles, Richard's brother, gestured vaguely to his plate. "So, Emily, did you prepare all of this yourself?" His tone made the question a compliment and a dismissal in the same breath. "Yes," Emily answered, her voice smooth but cool. "Every dish." His wife, Lauren, leaned slightly forward, her lips parted with performative curiosity. "The oxtail, isn't that rather strong?" Emily's smile didn't falter. "It's rich," she said calmly, "and soulful, a dish made with care and time. You can't rush something that good." A faint, uncomfortable chuckle circled the table, but Lauren's eyes slid away, and that was enough. The wine flowed, and so did the microaggressions. A comment from Michael's wife about how bold Emily's choice of centerpiece was, quickly followed by Margaret's half-hearted compliment on Emily's effort to blend their different styles. Each word, polished and poisonous, was designed to wound without leaving a mark. Through it all, Richard said nothing. Emily's hands gripped the stem of her wineglass, her nails pressing crescent moons into her palm. Her ears rang with the symphony of slights, some old, some new, all wrapped in velvet. She felt the invisible walls around her closing in, the kind she had learned to navigate long before she ever stepped into the Calloway household. But tonight, something inside her was shifting. The conversation drifted to current events, and soon someone, perhaps Charles, made an offhand remark about how everything these days seems to be about race. The room laughed softly, indulgently. Then Margaret added with a slight glance toward Emily, "It's such a shame how quickly some people play the victim card. The world was much simpler when everyone understood their place." The laughter this time was hesitant, thin. The air sharpened, charged with the static of something coming. Emily felt the pulse of her heartbeat in her throat. She set down her glass with a quiet, deliberate clink. "Perhaps," she said, her voice cutting through the shallow amusement like the edge of a blade, "the world felt simpler because the discomfort wasn't yours to bear." A hush fell so swiftly that the crackling of the fireplace suddenly felt deafening. Margaret's eyes, cold and sharp, locked on hers. "I beg your pardon?" Emily met her gaze without flinching. "Simple," she said, her voice soft but steely, "is often a privilege." The silence that followed was no longer polite. It was heavy, raw, real. Then came Richard's voice, slicing through it. "Emily," he said, his tone low and warning, "don't start." Emily's jaw tightened. She felt the old pressure, the one that told her to yield, to smooth it over, to be smaller. But the heat rising in her chest refused to be contained. "No, Richard," she said, her voice steady but simmering, "I won't be quiet just because it makes the room more comfortable." A murmur, soft and uneasy, spread through the table. All eyes turned to Richard, waiting, expecting. And he obliged. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, his voice cracking through the tension. "Can't you ever just—" It happened so fast. His hand, raised in frustration, struck her cheek with a sharp, stunning crack. The world stopped. Emily's head snapped to the side, her skin burning from the blow. The clatter of silverware ceased. The laughter, the murmurs, the pretense, all of it collapsed into an echoing void. The room froze. Faces turned pale. Some looked away. Others stared, shocked but silent. Not one moved to intervene. Emily's heart pounded, but not from pain. She felt something colder than fear and hotter than rage settle in her bones. And then she smiled. It wasn't a smile of warmth, nor surrender. It was something else, something sharp, something unbreakable. When she straightened, her voice, when it came, was calm as glass but edged with steel. "Well," she said into the deathly silence, "I suppose the show has finally started." The guests sat frozen, their eyes wide and their mouths sealed by the gravity of what they had witnessed. The room, with its opulent chandelier and gleaming silverware, suddenly felt suffocating. Richard stood, his face pale, his hand still curled from the strike as though he couldn't believe what he had done. His voice cracked, uncertain, trying to gather the world he had just shattered. "Emily." But Emily was already placing her napkin carefully on the table, smoothing it with an almost delicate grace. She looked not at him, but at the entire room, her voice clear and ringing. "I hope," she said softly, "that everyone enjoyed their dinner." And then, with the quiet poise of a queen abandoning a tarnished throne, she pushed back her chair. The scrape of the wood on the polished floor was the only sound in the room. Without a glance back, Emily turned and walked from the table. The first cracks of a long-buried storm had broken the surface, and beyond them, something new, something unstoppable was rising. The echo of the slap lingered in the room long after the crack of palm against skin had fallen silent. It was a hollow, ringing thing, an absence of sound so profound that it felt like the air itself had been sucked from the room. The faces around the table were frozen, their expressions carved from a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, something older, heavier, complicit silence. Emily felt the sting bloom hot and sharp on her cheek, but the pain was distant, secondary to the fire that roared within her chest. Her breath was steady, her posture poised. She did not flinch, she did not cry. She simply existed in the stillness of the moment that had shattered everything. Across from her, Margaret's hand, clad in the soft sheen of pearl bracelets, hovered mid-air, as if caught between applause and recoil. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyes wide with something that almost resembled, could it be, surprise, as though even she had not anticipated this scene. Richard, his hand still lowered from the blow, stood rigid, his chest heaving with the remnants of his outburst. His face, taut and flushed, flickered with something close to panic. His voice, when it came, was cracked and raw. "Emily," he said, her name stumbling from his lips as though he'd forgotten how to shape it. But Emily spoke first. Her voice, impossibly soft, cut through the tension like a cold blade. "Well," she said, the corners of her lips curving, not into a smile, but into something that could have been mistaken for it in the dim light, something dangerous and bright. "It seems the main course wasn't the only thing served tonight. The room, this room with its ancestral portraits, its antique silver, its heirloom mahogany table, polished to a faultless gleam, seemed to shrink, to collapse inward beneath the unbearable gravity of what had just occurred. The guests' reactions, muted as they were, came in fragments. Lauren, Charles's wife, lowered her wineglass with trembling fingers, her eyes wide and unblinking. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his throat bobbing with a swallow that did nothing to ease the dryness there. Even Thomas Calloway, granite-faced and ever stoic, tightened his jaw, his lips pressing into a line of cold, wordless disapproval, not at the act itself, but at the impropriety of the spectacle. But no one spoke. No one moved. No one dared. Because here, in the sanctum of the Calloway family, silence had always been the most valued currency. And shame? Shame was a thing to be buried under layers of civility and fine linens, not paraded across the dinner table. Emily, however, was done being buried. She reached down slowly and picked up her napkin from her lap, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as though wiping away a small, inconsequential spill rather than the phantom heat of her husband's hand from her skin. She folded the linen neatly, corner to corner, crease to crease, and set it beside her plate. Then she spoke again, and this time her voice filled the hollow space the silence had left behind. "You know," she said, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces, "I always wondered what it would take to finally break the silence at one of these dinners. I suppose now I have my answer." A muscle twitched in Richard's jaw. "Emily," he said again, firmer this time, his voice scraping against the brittle edge of control. "This isn't—" But she was already looking at him, and when she did, he stopped, the air between them thick and taut. "No," she said, her voice a thread of steel wrapped in silk. "Not this time. You've had your say, years of it. I think it's my turn now." A ripple of something uneasy passed through the room. Margaret shifted in her seat, the fine leather creaking beneath her. "Emily," she interjected, her voice low and cool, the polished edge of authority unmistakable. "Perhaps we should—" Emily's gaze snapped to her mother-in-law, and for the first time that evening, Margaret Calloway, the indomitable matriarch, the keeper of legacy and propriety, fell silent. "No," Emily said again, her voice cutting through Margaret's as effortlessly as glass through paper. "I think you should hear this too. You've all had so much to say over the years about me, about what I should be, how I should act, what I should accept. But you've never stopped to ask yourselves a simple question." The room seemed to hold its breath as Emily, her voice unwavering, delivered it herself. "What if I don't accept it?" The words fell like stones into a still pond, sending shock waves through the polite veneer of the gathering. "I have spent years at this table, enduring your glances, your whispers, your judgment. I've smiled through your slights, swallowed your barbs, and served you meals with hands you never cared to see shaking." She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes burning with something old and newly awakened. "But tonight," she said, her voice resonating with the fullness of her resolve, "you don't get to pretend you didn't see it. You don't get to sip your wine and look the other way. You saw what he did. All of you." A cold, heavy silence fell. Not one pair of eyes met hers. And that, Emily realized, was the final truth of this room. They had seen, they always saw, and they chose silence, every time. Slowly, she turned back to Richard. His face was a war zone of emotions, anger, guilt, fear. His lips parted, the beginnings of an apology. Too little, too late, forming there. But Emily only shook her head, a soft, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but brimming with something raw and breaking. "I used to wonder what it would take to make you see me, to really see me. And now I know." Her eyes flashed. "But you still won't, will you?" And in his silence she heard her answer, the final answer. With an exhale, long and steady, Emily felt something within her, something tightly bound for far too long, begin to unravel. The tension, the fear, The years of shrinking herself to fit inside a life too small to hold her, it broke. Her voice, when it came again, was different. Softer, but infinite. Not a spark, but a flame. "This," she said, her hand sweeping briefly across the table, across the room, across them all. "This is the last time. The last dinner, the last show, the last time you get to decide what I swallow and what I don't." She stepped back from her chair, her heels clicking against the polished floors, each step a declaration. "You've made your choices," she said, "and now I'm making mine." Richard's voice, rough with something that might have been desperation, chased her as she turned. "Emily." But she didn't stop. She walked. Not away, from him, from them, from this house built on legacies that rotted beneath the floorboards, but towards something else, something waiting, something she could no longer live without. Herself. And in the silence she left behind, the storm finally broke. The air outside the dining room felt different, cooler, cleaner, as though the walls had held their breath for too long. Emily's heels struck the marble foyer with a crisp, measured rhythm, each step carving a distance that felt more permanent than space could measure. Behind her, the muffled tension from the dining room buzzed like static, half-formed whispers, rustling fabric, and the uneasy scrape of chairs as the guests, unsure of their roles in this unplanned scene, hovered between scandal and spectacle. But Emily did not pause. She did not run. She walked, with the unhurried grace of a woman who no longer needed permission to leave. She reached the staircase, the old wood smooth beneath her palm. How many times had she climbed these steps, carrying baskets of laundry, balancing trays from family gatherings, or simply retreating from the sharp-edged conversations that had no place for her voice. The weight of all those silences pressed against her back, but tonight, for the first time, she felt no need to carry it. A voice, urgent and raw, broke through the tension. "Emily!" Richard's footsteps pounded behind her. She heard the unsteadiness in his stride, felt the jagged edges of his breath. "Emily, wait!" She reached the top of the stairs, her hand grazing the banister. For a flicker of a second, she considered continuing, closing the bedroom door between them like so many times before. But something stopped her. Not fear, not obligation, finality. Slowly, she turned. Richard stood halfway up the staircase, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with something frantic and unfamiliar. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice straining for control but fraying at the edges. You're making a scene." Emily's expression didn't shift, but her voice, when it came, was cold and clear. "No, Richard, you made the scene. I simply chose not to fade into the background of it." His jaw tightened. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You—" "Stop," she cut in, the single word landing like the drop of a gavel. "Just stop." The air between them thinned to a thread. For once, he did, and into that silence she placed the truth she had carried for far too long. "I have spent this entire marriage making myself small," she said, her voice steady but edged with something sharp, something long suppressed. "I've learned to smile when they mocked me, to stay quiet when they dismissed me. And I told myself, I told myself that it was love, that it was sacrifice, that one day they would see me. Or you would." Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "But the only person I made invisible was myself." Richard's face contorted with something desperate. "Emily, no!" But she didn't let him finish. She was done letting him finish. "I thought if I played the part well enough, if I cooked their meals, folded their linens, laughed at their jokes, if I swallowed enough, they'd let me belong." Her eyes, burning and bright, met his and did not waver. but you taught me something tonight, Richard." She descended a step, her voice lowering but gaining weight with every word. "You taught me that I don't belong here. I never did, because belonging isn't something you earn by breaking yourself into smaller pieces. It's something you claim by standing whole." She paused, her breath shallow but sure. "And I'm done shrinking for a place that was never meant to hold me." Richard's hands clenched at his sides, his voice rough with fear masquerading as authority. "You're not leaving," he said, the tremor in his voice betraying the command he tried to give. "We're not doing this." But Emily's answer was already given, as final and unmovable as stone. "Yes, we are." A flash of something, panic, flickered through his eyes. "What about the guests? What about—" "I don't care," she said, the words falling with the ease of a woman who had carried the burden of caring for far too long. "Let them talk. Let them stare. They've spent years watching me fade. Tonight, they can watch me walk away." Richard took a step forward, his voice softening to something pleading. "Emily, please, don't do this. We can fix it." Her gaze on him was unwavering, and yet there was something in it that he could not grasp, something distant, something already gone. "We," she said softly, tasting the word one last time, "we ended the moment your hand touched my face." The silence that followed was not the strained hush of discomfort, but the heavy, resolute quiet of something irrevocably broken. Emily turned. "I'm packing my things," she said, her voice simple, clean, "and tomorrow I'm leaving. For good." Behind her, Richard's voice, hollow and stunned, broke into the air like a splintering fault line. "Emily!" But she was already walking. Through the hallways that had caged her, past the paintings of ancestors who had never seen her as anything but out of place, beyond the invisible boundaries of a life that had never been hers to live. She entered the bedroom and closed the door behind her. The familiar room, once a sanctuary, then a prison, felt strange now, stripped of the power it once held. She reached for the closet, her fingers brushing against the fabric that had always felt like costumes. Dresses for parties where her voice was accessory, gowns for dinners where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed. She began to pack, but not with the frenzy of escape. She folded each garment with care, not out of sentimentality, but out of finality. She was not fleeing, she was leaving. And there is a difference, one measured not in haste, but in clarity. From behind the closed door, she heard footsteps pacing, muffled arguments. Richard's voice rising, then falling into a silence that told her he had no more weapons to wield, no more lines to hold. And then the sound of a door closing downstairs. The guests finally were leaving. The audience dismissed from the performance they never expected to witness. Emily paused, her hand on the last item, a framed photograph from their wedding day. She stared down at it, at the image of herself frozen in time, smiling and white, wide-eyed with hope and promise. She searched that face, that woman. She didn't hate her, she mourned her. And then, softly, she set the frame face down. When she zipped the final bag, the sound was clean, sharp, and absolute. A marriage, sealed over years of dinners and silences, ended not with a fight, but with a decision. She turned once more to the room. "Goodbye," she whispered, not to him, not to them, but to the woman she would never be again. And with that, Emily opened the door and stepped through it, into a night that felt, for the first time in years, like it belonged to her. Behind her, the house stood as it always had, grand, storied, and utterly unchanged. But the woman who walked away from it, she would never be the same. The night air was cool against Emily's skin as she stepped out of the house, her suitcase rolling lightly over the brick pathway. The Calloway estate loomed behind her, its grand facade bathed in the soft glow of porch lights, the towering columns standing like silent sentinels over a history she no longer belonged to. She had done it. She was leaving. The thought should have felt foreign, surreal. But as she reached her car, pressing the key fob with steady fingers, she realized that the fear she had expected, the trembling doubt, the second-guessing, was nowhere to be found. Instead, a strange calm settled over her, as though her body had been waiting for this moment long before her mind had caught up. From behind her, the door of the house burst open. "Emily, wait!" Richard's voice, hoarse and desperate, cut through the night, followed by the hurried thud of his footsteps against the brick steps. She didn't turn, didn't rush to open the car door. Instead, she exhaled, slow and measured, then faced him. He was disheveled, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up as if shedding the formality of the evening could make him more human in her eyes. His face was pale beneath the warm porch lights, his expression caught between anger and something resembling panic. "You can't just leave," he said, his voice sharp but cracking at the edges. "Not like this." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Like what, Richard?" "Like," he gestured vaguely, his hands clenching at his sides. "Like you're walking out of a dinner party instead of our marriage." She didn't flinch, didn't let the weight of his words pull her back. "I am walking out," she said plainly, "and I'm not coming back." His breath caught. He stepped forward, but she held up a hand, stopping him in place. "This isn't a fight, Richard," she continued, her voice calm, final. "I'm not leaving to punish you. I'm leaving because I should have done it a long time ago." Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, but buried beneath the pride he couldn't quite let go of. "We've had arguments before," he said, grasping for something, anything, "but we work through them." "Work through them?" A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. "You hit me tonight, Richard." The words, spoken so plainly, so factually, sent a ripple through him. His throat bobbed with a hard swallow. "Don't," she interrupted, her voice devoid of the softness he might have been expecting. "Don't say you didn't mean it. Don't tell me it was the heat of the moment, or that you lost control, because it wasn't the first time you raised your voice at me. It wasn't the first time you made me feel small." Richard's shoulders tensed. "Emily, and if I stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it won't be the last." The admission settled between them, heavy and undeniable. He couldn't argue with it, and for the first time in their years together, he didn't try. Instead, his jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides before finally, they dropped, defeated. "I thought you loved me," he said, almost too quiet to hear. Emily's chest ached, but not with regret, with grief. "I did," she admitted. "I loved the idea of us. I loved the hope of you. But I can't keep loving something that only exists in my head." Richard's breath hitched. He looked at her like a man standing on the edge of a cliff realizing too late that the ground beneath him was crumbling. "You said you'd fight for us," he said, his voice raw. She nodded. "I did." Then softer, "But not alone." For a moment, he just stood there, his hands gripping his hips, his gaze locked on the ground between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house. Emily exhaled, feeling the weight of his retreat settle over her like a closing chapter. She didn't watch him disappear. Instead, she opened the car door, slid inside, and started the engine. As the car pulled away from the house, headlights cutting through the darkened streets, Emily didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already left. The sky had just begun to lighten when Emily stepped into the quiet office of her lawyer. The receptionist, a kind woman in her 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, greeted her with a warm but knowing look. "Good morning, Miss Calloway. Would you like some coffee?" Emily hesitated at the name. Calloway. The last time she'd heard it, it had felt like an identity, a role she was meant to uphold. Now it felt foreign, like an ill-fitting coat she was finally shedding. She exhaled. "Just Emily," she said. The receptionist nodded. "Of course. Just Emily." A few minutes later, she sat across from a sturdy mahogany desk, a thick stack of papers in front of her. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored navy suit, adjusted her glasses. "You're certain about this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Emily nodded. "Yes." The lawyer slid the papers forward. "Then all we need is your signature." Emily picked up the pen. The weight of it was heavier than she expected, or maybe that was just the moment itself. She had signed countless documents in this life: marriage certificates, dinner party invitations, RSVPs to events where she had smiled for the sake of appearances. But this signature, this one, felt different. She pressed ink to paper, her hand steady, and signed her name. Not Emily Calloway, just Emily. As she lifted the pen, she felt it. Not sadness, not fear, but freedom. She looked up at the lawyer and exhaled. "What happens now?" she asked. The lawyer smiled, tucking the papers neatly into a folder. "Now," she said, "now you start over." And for the first time in a long, long time, Emily felt ready to do exactly that. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, rich and earthy, blending with the soft notes of jazz humming from the speakers. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows, casting a warm, amber glow over the polished wooden tables. The small cafe, nestled on a quiet corner of the city, was modest but inviting. Its shelves lined with small potted plants, framed photographs, and books worn from many hands. At the center of it all stood Emily. No longer Emily Calloway, no longer a woman contained by someone else's story, but simply herself. She moved behind the counter with a grace born from confidence, her hands steady as they pressed the filter into the espresso machine. Steam hissed, and the soft clink of ceramic cups played like a familiar rhythm. The cafe was hers, entirely hers, from the cracked tiles she had repaired herself to the handwritten menu above the counter, adorned with small flourishes that reflected her own style. The chalkboard listed the specials for the day. Grandma's sweet potato pie, a bestseller by now. Oxtail stew Fridays, a tradition she'd carried with her. Calloway blend coffee, a name she'd chosen intentionally, not as a burden, but as a reclamation. She had taken the name that once felt like a cage and turned it into something entirely her own. A small brass plaque sat beside the register. A place for everyone, a place for stories. Emily. The bell above the entrance chimed softly, and Emily glanced up to see her first customer of the day, a young woman with a notebook tucked under her arm and a tired look in her eyes. She approached the counter hesitantly, her voice soft. "Hi, I heard you make a sweet potato pie here?" Emily's lips curved into a warm smile. "You heard right. It's my grandmother's recipe." The woman smiled back, some of the fatigue easing from her expression. "Then I'll definitely have a slice. And a coffee, please." As Emily prepared the order, the woman's gaze wandered over the photographs on the wall. Snapshots of the cafe's early days, the first tables, the first customers. Among them was a photo Emily had taken on opening day, her holding a steaming cup of coffee, the door behind her propped open to welcome the world inside. "Is this your place?" the woman asked as Emily returned with her order. Emily nodded, her eyes glinting with pride. "It is. It feels peaceful." The woman paused as though choosing her words carefully. "Like somewhere you can be yourself." Emily's smile softened, and something warm settled in her chest. That's exactly what it's meant to be. The woman gave a small, grateful nod before settling into a corner seat by the window, opening her notebook with a sigh of contentment. Emily stood for a moment, watching, feeling. This, she realized, was what she had fought for. Not just freedom from what she'd left behind, but the freedom to create something new, something real. The cafe filled slowly as the morning stretched into noon. Friends met for conversation, strangers became regulars, and laughter blended with the gentle clatter of dishes. People came not just for coffee or pie, but for the space, the warmth, the belonging. As the lunch crowd thinned, Emily found herself wiping down tables when the familiar chime of the bell sounded again. She glanced up and froze. Richard stood in the doorway. For a brief moment, time contracted, the air tightening as memories flickered sharp and bright, like the sudden crack of glass before it shatters. But then, just as quickly, they passed. She felt no fear, no anger, only clarity. He looked different. Older, maybe, or simply worn. His eyes searched the room before settling on her, and something flickered there, something uncertain, perhaps even humbled. "Emily," he said, his voice rough but quiet. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she straightened from the table, placing the cloth aside with calm precision. "Richard." A pause, long and heavy with things unsaid. He hesitated, then cleared his throat, his hands tightening into fists and then releasing at his sides. "I heard about this place. I wanted to see it." His eyes flicked over the space, the photographs, the menu, the plaque with her name. His jaw shifted, as though struggling with something deep and tangled within himself. "It's beautiful," he said, and the words came not with his old, polished charm, but with something stripped bare and real. He paused, his voice lowering. "You did all this." Emily's gaze stayed on him, unreadable but steady. "I did?" A beat, then, "I'm sorry," he said, and the words hung in the air, stark and simple. "For everything. For not seeing you, for hurting you, for every way I failed you." Emily felt the weight of his words, not like chains, but like something finally being set down. "I know," she said softly. "But Richard—" She met his eyes fully, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I didn't build this for you to apologize. I built it because I stopped waiting for you to see me." His lips pressed together, a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, but also recognition. He nodded, the motion slow and accepting. "I understand." A silence, then, "Can I stay for a cup of coffee?" he asked quietly, "just as a customer." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then, with the faintest lift of her brow, "You're welcome to," she said, turning towards the counter. "The house blend is my grandmother's favorite." Richard gave a small, almost sad smile, as though he understood everything wrapped in that sentence. "I'll take it." The sun dipped low, casting long golden rays through the windows. The cafe was empty now, the tables wiped down, chairs stacked. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on its polished surface. She watched the final beams of sunlight dance across the floor and felt the deep, steady hum of peace within her chest. Tonight, there was no grand applause, no audience, only the quiet, simple truth of a life she had chosen, and that had chosen her back. Emily turned off the lights one by one, leaving the cafe bathed in the soft glow from the street. At the door, she paused, glancing once more at the space she had built from the bones of everything she had once believed she lost. Then she smiled, and with a soft click, she locked the door behind her. The night stretched wide and full ahead, but Emily was no longer afraid, because she knew with every piece of her soul this was only the beginning. The warm hum of the cafe's steady rhythm wrapped around Emily like a familiar shawl. The aroma of brewed coffee and sweet spices lingered in the air, and the low murmur of conversations blended with the faint strains of jazz drifting from the speakers. It was the kind of day that felt effortless, fluid, bright, and hers. The bell above the door chimed, and Emily, wiping her hands on a cloth, looked up with her usual welcoming smile, only for it to flicker, then fade. Standing at the entrance, as though the past had torn itself from memory and walked into the present, was Margaret Calloway. The years had touched Margaret lightly, her posture as straight and composed as ever, her pearls gleaming against a perfectly tailored navy coat. But there was something else, something that hadn't been there before: hesitation. Emily's fingers tightened around the cloth. The sudden weight of old wounds pressed against her chest, echoes of sharp words, cold glances, and the bruising silence of 1,000 dinners where her presence had been tolerated but never accepted. Yet she felt no tremor of fear, no heat of anger, only the steady, anchored calm of a woman who had reclaimed herself. Margaret's sharp eyes scanned the cafe, the rich woodwork, the clusters of comfortable seating, the framed photographs of smiling patrons, and above it all, the small brass plaque beside the register, a place for everyone. Emily. Her gaze returned to Emily. "So," she said, her voice as smooth and clipped as ever, "this is what you've built." Emily folded the cloth and set it down with care. "It is." A pause. Margaret's eyes, so practiced at judgment, flickered with something guarded but curious. "I heard about it," she said finally, her voice threading through the air like a thread waiting to knot. "From Richard." Emily's expression remained composed, but she felt the undercurrent in Margaret's words. "And what did he say?" Margaret's lips pressed together briefly. "He said, 'You've done well for yourself.'" The slightest tilt of her head. "He said you were happy." Emily met her gaze without wavering. "I am." Another pause, taut and delicate, as if the conversation balanced on the edge of something unspoken. Then, "I'll have a coffee," Margaret said. It was not an olive branch, not quite, but it was something. Emily's brows lifted ever so slightly, then, without a word, she turned to the machine. The familiar hiss of steam, the comforting clink of ceramic, each sound a note in the symphony of her space. She poured the dark, rich brew and set the cup on the counter. Margaret approached, her gloved fingers brushing the saucer's edge. She did not immediately drink, but instead spoke softly. "I suppose I should say, I was sorry to hear about the divorce." Emily's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained even. "Were you?" A faint stiffening in Margaret's posture, but then her voice, colder than the air outside, said, "It's a shame when marriages end, especially ones that could have been saved with more effort." The air between them crystallized, thin and razor-edged. Emily's reply came, smooth and quiet. "Effort?" Margaret's eyes met hers, cool and assessing. "Marriage is not meant to be easy, Emily. It requires patience, endurance." Her voice, so familiar in its polished condescension, carried the weight of every dismissal Emily had ever endured. And sometimes one must know what to forgive. A slow heat unfurled in Emily's chest, but her voice remained steady as glass. "Forgive?" she repeated, her hands resting lightly on the counter. "Forgive a hand across my face? Forgive years of silence and cruelty wrapped in civility?" Her eyes, burning with something long banked but never extinguished, locked with Margaret's. "Tell me, Margaret, what exactly should I have forgiven?" Margaret's face remained still, but her fingers trembled slightly against the cup. "I'm not here to excuse what happened that night," she said, her voice lower but still clipped. "But you chose to destroy a family instead of enduring." The words landed with the cold weight of a verdict, and something inside Emily, something buried under years of muted battles, broke free. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but thunderous with truth. "No, Margaret," she said, "I chose to survive." Margaret's eyes flickered, something in them shifting, wariness, or perhaps something she couldn't name. Emily continued, her voice low but searing. "You want to talk about endurance? I endured. I endured every look, every whisper, every time you made me feel like an outsider in my own home. I endured your son's temper, his neglect, his pride that let him believe my silence was submission." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unyielding. "But survival isn't endurance. It's escape. And escape isn't failure. It's freedom." The cafe seemed to hold its breath. For once, Margaret had no immediate retort. Her lips pressed thin, her eyes darting briefly to the brass plaque, "A place for everyone." A flicker of something, so faint Emily almost missed it. Not warmth, but understanding, or perhaps acknowledgement. Margaret's hand, slow and deliberate, lifted the cup. She sipped. Her gaze stayed on Emily, and when she lowered the cup, she spoke, quietly, and with the weight of something rare from her lips. "It's good." Emily felt the air shift, the smallest crack in the cold facade. She did not smile, but she nodded. "It is." Margaret set the cup down gently on the saucer. She stood still for a moment, as though considering some unseen door and what lay beyond it. Then, without another word, she reached into her coat and laid down the exact change. No tip, of course not, but no cutting remark either. At the door, she paused. The bell, half rung, caught her hesitation. She did not look back fully, but her voice, low and clipped, drifted over her shoulder. "For what it's worth." She paused, her fingers tightening briefly on the handle. "I see why you chose this. You were never going to fit into our world." Emily's reply came, soft but immovable. "No," she said, "but I was always going to build my own." The bell chimed and Margaret Calloway walked out into the cold. The door closed with a soft hush, leaving behind only the warm hum of the cafe. Emily stood for a moment, the echoes of the confrontation settling into the quiet corners of the space she had claimed as her own. There was no triumph in her chest, no satisfaction, only the deep, unshakable stillness of knowing that she had spoken her truth, and it was enough. A slow breath escaped her lips. She turned back to the counter, wiping it clean with a steady hand, her heart as clear and open as the space around her. The past, at last, had come to face her. And she had stood, not as a shadow, not as a guest in someone else's life, but as the woman she had fought to become. And the past had left. But she remained. The morning light was golden and soft, casting long beams through the cafe windows, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny stars. The sign on the door still read "closed," but inside, Emily moved with the ease of ritual, turning chairs upright, adjusting the centerpiece on each table, and checking the day's pastries, the scent of cinnamon and coffee already curling through the air. The confrontation with Margaret lingered in her mind, not as a wound, but as a seal, an ending she had never known she needed. There was no triumph in it, no victory parade, only the clean, sharp clarity of a page turned. She had met her past head-on and had not yielded. And now, finally, the road before her felt wide and open, without shadows at its edges. The brass bell above the door chimed softly, not with a customer, but with a friend. "Good morning, Emily." The warm voice belonged to Sophia, her closest friend and one of the first people who had believed in this cafe's dream. Sophia, with her bright scarf, her laptop always tucked under one arm, and a smile that could break through any storm. Emily's face lit up. "Hey, Sophia, you're early." Sophia grinned, sliding onto her favorite stool at the counter. "Couldn't resist. Plus, I need my fix before I dive into emails. You know how these Monday mornings are." Emily already had a cup brewing. "House blend?" she teased. "Or are you feeling adventurous today?" "House blend. You know I live for that little chocolate note you sneak in," Sophia replied with a wink. Emily chuckled, sliding the cup across the counter. "One house blend, just how you like it." Sophia took a long, satisfied sip, sighing contentedly. Heaven." She glanced at Emily, a curious tilt to her head. "So," she said, drawing out the word, "I heard there was a visitor yesterday, wearing pearls and a permanent scowl." Emily wiped her hands on a towel but didn't pause in her rhythm. "You heard right." Sophia's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "And?" Emily's lips curled slightly. "And she came, she saw, she disapproved, and then she left." Sophia set down her cup with a soft clink. "And how do you feel?" Emily paused, the question settling into the space between them. She thought of Margaret's cold eyes, her clipped words, then of her departure, and the sound of the cafe door closing behind her like the final chord of a long, unfinished song. "I feel," Emily began, her voice slow, reflective. "Free. I feel free." She glanced out the window, the street beginning to stir with life. "For so long, I thought freedom would come with her apology, or with Richard's remorse, but it didn't. It came the moment I stopped needing either." Sophia's smile was soft, proud. "That," she said simply, "is power." Emily returned the smile, a warmth blooming from somewhere deep. "It is." By noon, the cafe pulsed with life. The tables were filled with faces familiar and new, students tapping on laptops, couples sharing desserts, and friends laughing over their third cup of coffee. The hum of conversation, the clatter of plates, and the rich, steady hiss of the espresso machine blended into a comforting, living symphony. Emily moved among them, not as a hostess, not as a performer, but as a part of the space itself. She paused to chat with regulars, exchanged recipes with a customer curious about the sweet potato pie, and accepted compliments on the cozy feel of the cafe with a humble nod and a soft, heartfelt thank you. She felt it in every corner, in every exchange. This place was hers. But more than that, it was everyone's. The rush slowed as the sun dipped westward, casting long, honeyed rays across the floor. Emily was clearing a table when the bell chimed again. She glanced up and froze just for a moment. It was Richard. His figure, once so familiar, felt distant now, a ghost from a different life. He stood near the doorway, his eyes sweeping the cafe. When they found her, he hesitated, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might turn and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward. Emily felt no tremor of fear, only the curiosity that comes when the echoes of the past meet the present. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached. "Richard," she greeted, her tone steady, neutral. "Didn't expect to see you here." He offered a small, careful smile, one that lacked the arrogance she once knew. "I didn't expect to be here," he admitted, his voice quieter than she remembered. "But I was in the neighborhood. He paused, then glanced around. "I've heard a lot about this place. People say it's special." Emily's gaze didn't waver. "It is." A pause. Then, "Can I sit for a moment?" he asked, his voice threading softly between request and uncertainty. Emily considered, then nodded. "Sure." They settled at a small table near the window. Richard's eyes roamed the space again, landing on the framed photographs, the smiling faces of patrons, the snapshots of Emily behind the counter. His gaze lingered on one photo from the cafe's opening day. Emily, apron tied tight, her smile radiant and proud. "You did all this," he said, his voice holding something like awe. "It's amazing." Emily folded her hands lightly on the table. "I did," she replied simply. A beat of silence, then, softly, "I've thought a lot about that night," Richard said. "About everything, and I know I can't take back what I did, or who I was." His eyes met hers, and for once they were not searching for forgiveness. "I hurt you, and I know you didn't deserve that. I know that now." Emily listened, her face calm, her heart steady. "I wanted to say," he drew a breath, "I'm sorry, truly, for the ways I failed you, for not seeing you when I should have, for everything." His voice, stripped of pride, laid bare something real. Regret, yes, but also acceptance. Emily's response, when it came, was not anger, nor was it absolution. "I believe you," she said softly. Richard's shoulders seemed to fall slightly, a weight leaving them that had been carried too long. "But," she continued, her voice gentle but firm, "your apology is yours to carry. My healing is mine." Richard nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, understanding. "I see that now," he said quietly, "and I'm glad you're happy, Emily." She smiled then, soft and sure. "I am." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was light, clean, like the sky after a storm. Richard stood, offering a small, almost shy smile. "I'll let you get back to your place. I just wanted you to know." Emily rose with him, her voice warm but clear. "Thank you for coming." He turned to leave, but then paused. "Emily?" She raised an eyebrow. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think someday we could be okay?" She considered, then gave the only answer that felt true. "We already are." And with that, Richard nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Goodbye, Emily." She watched as he left, the bell chiming softly in his wake. The cafe grew quiet with the approach of evening. The last customers trickled out, and Emily locked the door, flipping the sign to closed. She leaned briefly against the counter, her eyes sweeping the space, the plants, the photographs, the worn wooden floor. Here was her history, her labor, her heart. But more importantly, here was her future. With a small, satisfied sigh, she moved to the stereo, turning up the music. Soft, slow jazz, a sound that felt like home. And then, without hurry, without ceremony, she poured herself a cup of her house blend, rich and deep, with that familiar note of chocolate that always made her smile. She sat by the window, the cup warm between her palms, and watched as the last amber light of day gave way to the velvet hush of night. No grand applause greeted her. No audience watched her victory. But Emily didn't need them, because she felt it. In the quiet peace of this space, hers, entirely hers, she felt the fullness of her journey, and she knew with a certainty that reached her bones. The story wasn't over. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating narratives and powerful journeys. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And if you're ready for more, check out our other videos. You might just find your next favorite. See you in the next one.